Hi, good afternoon. It's so nice to see so many of you here this afternoon. I know a lot of you. For those of you who I don't know, I'm Jenny Gurman-Moles. I'm a professor in the Sociology and Anthropology department. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Dr. Tamara Vukov. Last year, while I was attending a conference on mobilities, I first heard Dr. Vukov talking about her research with migrant justice organizing networks. And as I was listening to her presentation, I just kept thinking how much Holy Cross students would love to know about this research. And so when I discovered that Tom Landy was putting together a speaker series on borders, movement, and ethics, I thought what a wonderful opportunity to invite Dr. Vukov to Holy Cross. So she visits us today from Drexel University, where she is a visiting research professor and SSHRC, postdoctoral scholar at the Center for Mobilities Research and Policy. She holds a joint PhD in communication from Concordia University, and she was a postdoctoral scholar at the Department of Art History and Communication Studies at McGill University. Dr. Vukov's research has been published in several journals, including the International Journal of Cultural Studies, Public, Recherche Féministe, Topia, and the Canadian Journal of Communication. And she is the author of a forthcoming book titled Affective Politics, Effective Borders, News Media Events and the Governmental Formation of Canadian Immigration Policy. And she's currently in post-production on a feature-length documentary film following the experiences of workers and refugees under the post-socialist economic transition in Serbia. Her title, the title of her talk this afternoon is On the Ethics of Borders, Insights and Media Interventions by Migrant Justice Movements. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Tamara Vukov.
I'm just going to make sure, oh yeah, the mic's working. Thank you very much, Jenny, and it's a pleasure to be here. I also want to thank the McFarland Center, Tom Landy, Jenny, Patricia Hinchcliffe, I believe, who also did a lot to organize my visit here. And I'm excited to hear also your ideas, your interests, and your reactions to the talk I've prepared for you. As Jenny said, I'm someone who has a bit of a hybrid profile. I'm a university researcher and academic, and I'm also a filmmaker. And you might see a little bit in this talk how those different facets of my own practice come together, because I'm going to be looking a lot at media practices and media activism in migrant justice movements. So I'm going to start off with a bit of a quote to get us thinking a little bit about the topic of borders and how to think about borders differently than we're often presented with in day-to-day life. So this is a quote from a Swiss media artist named Ursula Biemann, and she has a video called Performing the Border that came out in 1999. And in it she says, "You need the crossing of bodies for the border to become real. Otherwise you just have this discursive construction. There is nothing natural about the border. It's a highly constructed place that gets reproduced through the crossing of people. Because without the crossing, there is no border. It's just an imaginary line, a river, or it's just a wall. You need the crossing of bodies to produce the type of real place as a border. The border is a highly performative place." So, and I think what she's trying to get at is how to start thinking about how do we deconstruct this thing that's often presented to us as this natural thing, you know, the borders of the nation state, other kinds of borders, as just this reality, and that actually has something that has a history that didn't always exist in the same forms as it does now, and so on. So that's a little bit of what I'm going to be looking at. So in her video, Ursula Biemann examines the links between gendered labor in the free trade maquiladora zones of the Mexico-US border, new media, and the uneven politics of mobility that shapes the material performances of borders. As the video poignantly portrays, borders are produced through the movement of bodies, and it is in the very channeling of different bodies along differential routes of mobility, who has access to mobility, what kind, and through different techniques of immobilization, such as detention or deportation, that different border regimes and different border practices are produced. So as I mentioned already, this lecture emerges out of my own engagement as both a participant and practitioner with media practices and interventions that have emerged from migrant justice movements, organizing in a number of locales in the global north. What I'm going to be looking at today are a few concrete instances of what I will call no-border media practices and interventions. And they're going to be in a couple of fairly scattered sites, but it'll be interesting also in the discussion to perhaps try to make the links and also some of the differences between the different sites. So I'm going to be looking at recent cases in Germany, France, and then a particular no-border technological media intervention in the US. But before I get to these actual media interventions, I want to begin by opening up a broader line of thought about the performance of borders that we've already started to lay out and think through a little bit. And think about the work they do in terms of the ethics and the politics of mobility and immobility, and what it means to talk of increasingly oppressive and unjust or unethical performances of the border by state institutions today. And one of the things I also want to consider, and I will in a moment, is how borders are changing in this particular juncture. So there's a political scientist named Peter Andreas, and he's argued that border control is, and this is a quote, a public performance for which the border functions as a kind of political stage. That successful border management depends on successful image management. And that this image management, or this need to produce a particular image of the border and how it functions, does not necessarily correspond with actual levels of deterrence. So this claim of who gets in and who doesn't, that there's a kind of image politics to it versus what the actual practice is. So border control efforts are not only actions, they're gestures that communicate meaning. So he's trying to get at a kind of gap between the visible manifestations of the border that seek to promote an image of closure, of migrant control, of controlling who gets in and who gets out, and that at the same time, these actual border practices never actually achieve what they promise. This promise of, in many cases, if we're talking about total closure or total control, is never actually in practice what these performances do. In fact, what they actually do is reconfigure the actual practices of movements of migrants, whether through infrastructure such as detention centers or the production of precarious routes of mobility through border policing functions. And Rita Raley, who's another person who's written a lot about, I guess, media interventions in borders, she notes that the staging of performances of border security tend to overshadow what the actual practices of deterrence are, due to the symbolic power of obsessive and showy security practices along the border. And so the body of media practices that I'm going to be mapping out all seek to ethically intervene on and disrupt the image management, as well as the practice of mobility control that states are putting into place and performing a particular version of securitized borders that we've had over the last 10 years. And so that's also gesturing to another sort of way in which borders are changing right now, that we have these kind of new mediations of the border through technological means, or what migration scholars and activists have called smart borders. So there's this increasing technologization of the border. We're increasingly using biometrics, databases, high-tech forms of border control to achieve this kind of fantasy of perfect control. And whether this is like the Schengen information system in Europe, no-fly lists, biometric scannings that we increasingly see at airports, or at various borders, this is all tied up to a larger industry, technological industry as well, and that's what part of these practices are intervening on as well. And what it's also doing is it means that the border is shifting from a strictly territorial marker. It's no longer just this mark in the land. But it's becoming more mobile through these databases, through different ways of tracking people's movements. So it's not just a fixed or controlled line in the earth. And one of the examples I'm going to give, just very briefly, is a recent initiative, a somewhat failed US government initiative called SBINet. And just talk about that for a minute to give you a sense of what I'm getting at with this notion of the Border 2.0. So this was announced in 2005 by then Department of Homeland Security Secretary Michael Chertoff. The military contractor Boeing was awarded a $750 million contract to build a virtual border fence, which was known as SBINet, or the Secure Border Initiative. So the vision for this virtual border was of an integrated system of personnel or border agents, technology, and rapid response coordinated through a single, this is a quote, single integrated border security technology solution. And Boeing pitched to create a system of 1,800 towers that would be mobile, that would create a virtual fence through combining data coming in from radar, cameras, ground sensors, thermal imaging, and ground sensors that could detect movement and footsteps and even voices, as well as motion detectors and wireless broadband. And this would all be transmitted, this data, through these mobile towers into a common operating picture to give you this real-time picture of all movements on the border. So this was sort of the promise, and you can see it's like this fairly high-tech, sophisticated solution that's being offered to certain anxieties that have been raised around migrant movements over the last, it has a long history, but in a particular way over the last 10 years. And as I say, there's these mobile sensor units which could not be tied to the geography of the land. They could be moved around, and also where towers couldn't go, we'd also have UAVs or drones that could have airborne sensors, and also deliver stuff from, so it's like this very sci-fi kind of vision of the virtual border. And the pilot project for SBInet, which is known as Project 28, is located in a 28-mile sector of Tucson near the Arizona-Mexico border. And the virtual fence started to be constructed there in 2007. And one thing to also note, then, is this push for a technologically driven virtual border is also bound up a lot with issues of privatization, the military industry, and the militarization of border control that we've seen, so that they're also, like Boeing and other companies, making a lot of money out of promising these high-tech solutions. And often with very little transparency, a lot of spending, and limited public oversight. And I'll show you, this is a political cartoon that was put out in the wake of the bit of the boondoggle that the virtual fence SBInet became. So Project 28 ran into many logistical and technical difficulties and was soon deemed to be ineffective by US Customs and Border Patrol. One of the many problems found with Project 28 was the fact that radar and ground sensors could be triggered by heavy rainfall or tumbleweed or things like this, that anything could trigger it, really. And, among many other problems. So, and I don't think that this is just a question of technology or technical failure. I think it says something about the kind of over-responsiveness that's really the system has been kind of designed to set up. And you could even say a sort of paranoia. So basically last year, about a year ago, Janet Napolitano, citing ballooning costs, the endless delays, and the poor return on investment of Project 28, announced the cancellation of Boeing's contract. In the 4 years of its operation, the pilot phase of SBInet had absorbed over $1 billion in congressional funding to construct 53 miles of virtual fence in Arizona. And this was something that was shelved quite quietly. It's not something we've heard. I don't know how many people have heard about this. But when you think about $1 billion of funding over 4 years for 53 miles of fence, you can see the sort of lack of proportion that's going on in the investment in these projects. Additionally, it was found that the part of the fence that was operational was identifying less than 50%. It was promising that it was going to identify 95% of border crossings, and in the end, it was less than 50%. And so the project was quietly shelved, but it's not completely over either. It's sort of been renamed the Arizona Border Surveillance Technology Plan, and Project 28 still continues to operate in the Tucson area and has new funding requests of about $427 million over the coming 2 years. And of course, this has raised concerns in the communities and in general as well. So that's just to give you a little bit of a sense of where, even if it's a somewhat failed project, where the push, this kind of technological push for borders, and how they're becoming more mobile and more technologically driven, how that's happening. Now, to turn a little bit to no-border media movements, so what I'm looking at here is these shifting politics of borders, mobility, and migration through the lens of social movements that are contesting these new smart borders and forms of border control. And I see these movements as drawing a lot on what Walter Mignolo calls border knowledges. So as an ethical point of departure and also an epistemological one, what forms of knowledge, it's really trying to understand and convey the knowledges of those who bear the brunt of borders, who live the downside of these forms of border control from below. And I think a lot of what these movements also bring out, and that's what I want to touch on in this presentation, is also the strategies of agency and mobility that migrants engage in when they face these border regimes. So in the book Escape Routes, a group of migration theorists from what's in Europe is called the Autonomy of Migration School talk about how borders operate as institutions of mobility control that have fundamentally unethical dimensions. And I think that's key to all of the interventions we're looking at today. They're also making ethical and political claims about what it is that these border regimes are putting into place. But also, as much as these state-driven initiatives have their, very top-down sides, they're always reactive to actual practices of migrant mobility that are much more active, that have agency. So it's also not about creating a dystopian picture of what Project 28, has actually failed to do, but really looking at what is active and what is what these kinds of practices of mobility reveal about larger social dynamics. So Angela Metropoulos first suggested the term no-border media as a loose set of practices that are emerging from these different movements for migrant justice in a variety of locales, and that use tactical media and interventionist media in challenging these state regimes of visibility and control in relation to migrant mobilities. She argues that they're rooted in provisional, mobile, and do-it-yourself media. So again, there's a very different kind of media practice than what we see with something like Project 28. And that they've played an important role in forwarding these movements for justice and freedom for migrant undocumented people. So part of what I'm going to look at is a particular set of different practices, and also really try and draw out what are some of the ethical insights that they're trying to bring to bear. So what I'm going to do is, if we have time, I will look at 4 projects at 3 key sites. So the first is No One is Illegal, or Kein Mensch Ist Illegal in Germany. I'm going to look at a set of mobilizations that happened in France a couple of years ago by the Sans-Papier movement, and finally the Transborder Immigrant Tool by the Electronic Disturbance Theater in the US. And look at what these media interventions and projects try to bring out about what are the ethical principles of borders, what are these borders actually doing. I'm going to skip over methodologically what I'm doing. A lot of part of the challenge of this kind of research is it's very multi-sited. I'm looking at very different locales, but what I'm trying to get at, and what I think is really coming out in the way that these movements operate, is that there is this kind of fluid back and forth that's not top-down. These aren't, this isn't a transnational organization that's coordinating these movements from above, but it's very much grassroots responses to the ways these borders are shifting in different sites. And a lot of what I've done is also engaged in participatory and action research, so interviewing people in these movements about what they have to say. And so I'm going to bring out some of that as well. So I'm going to start with Kein Mensch Ist Illegal, or the No One is Illegal network, and a particular campaign they did in Germany called the Deportation Class Campaign. So this is a particularly influential campaign that came out in 2000, so about 10 years ago. So this is when we also see a lot of these shifts happening that I'm sort of mapping in terms of the emergence of smart borders. And this was active for a number of years. The deportation class sub-campaign set out to target Lufthansa Airlines and eventually KLM for their involvement in the business of migrant deportations. The campaign had several components, including art and graphic design, online actions, mass protests, and tactical interventions. And a lot of these things, we also have to sort of think a bit historically. These things are very standard now, and we see, more interesting and more problematic uses of these kind of online campaigns. But at the time, this was fairly new. It was kind of a fairly pioneering campaign in the emergence of this kind of digital activism. Kein Mensch Ist Illegal also held a contest to come up with the design for the campaign, and which very much actually borrowed from the corporate branding of Lufthansa and KLM and mimicked and parodied it in certain ways. So you can see this is like deportation class under $400 to be deported to Manila, and so on. And also, this took place at a very specific moment in the reshaping of European Union borders. And the campaign really sought to highlight the increasing role at the time of bilateral agreements and the role of transportation companies in the closure of European Union borders. It also sought to not address itself solely to the state and ask the state to change things, but to directly target the company Lufthansa and also encourage the public and people as everyday citizens in their capacity as passengers, as well as airline employees, to refuse to participate in the deportation chain. So this included, I'll show you a video in a moment, repeated demonstrations at Lufthansa shareholder meetings, and with the collaboration of the Electronic Disturbance Theater, who I'll come back to in a little later, they also had an online virtual sitting of the Lufthansa servers. And at the time, that was a fairly novel tactic and was enough to get a good deal of wider media attention. And part of what the campaign was trying to do is make visible the often hidden, unethical practices of state repression and mobility control, and particularly the role of other non-state agents in these practices of deportation. And as I already hinted, this involved a lot of parody and what no one as legal artists that I interviewed called image contamination, which is a tactic that tries to infiltrate and mimic the branding strategies of corporations while creating new associations to contaminate the whitewash that corporate branding seeks to achieve. And this is a bit of a quote with them about it. And again, this is something that I think with groups like the Yes Men and other people has become much more widespread, but at the time was a fairly novel technique. They said the corporate world often works through image transfers, trying to associate your product, tobacco or whatever, with a happy image of some sort. And the opposite, what they were trying to do, they were calling image beschmutzen. This is my faulty German, which means to make it dirty. So instead of associating these images with positive things, really trying to contaminate it and show the downside of what these corporations are doing. And so they very much use the advertising aesthetics and the corporate design of Lufthansa to that end. So that what they're really trying to achieve is that when someone thinks of Lufthansa, they think deportation and making that association a kind of automatic thing. And this extended to widely to corporate parody site, a series of activist performances at airport and shareholder meetings. And again, the aim was really to try and incite the wider public and employees to refuse to participate in this. This is a video that shows some of what they did. This is one of the activists dressed, very much in Lufthansa flight attendant outfit, doing a kind of ad about Lufthansa and showing their deportation practices.
Hallo, herzlich willkommen am Flughafen Düsseldorf.
In German and French and English, so I can give you a little bit, but just like welcome to Lufthansa.
Hello and welcome at Düsseldorf Airport. Ich bin Carola Müller, Flugbegleiterin der Lufthansa.
I'm a flight attendant with Lufthansa.
Ja, das kann
is it a dream job? Yes, it is.
Ein tolles Gefühl, Teil der weltweiten
And
Verbindung.
it's amazing to participate in international relations.
Leute aus aller Herren Länder sind unsere Gäste.
Someone being chained up and deported. And these are the interventions they did at the actual shareholder meetings, where they also dressed up as flight attendants. And here they're describing to passengers what to do if you're on a plane and you see someone being deported, to stand up and to intervene and to prevent the flight from taking off. And this is them enacting a deportation in the airport. So again, it's really, yeah, that's it for that. Trying to make visible these practices that most of us don't see. and that these companies are engaged in. The campaign had a number of concrete outcomes. It included the eventual refusal of Lufthansa employees and the Pilots Association to fly Lufthansa planes that had been slated to deport migrants. So, this was actually the Pilots Association responded very much and made a statement that they weren't going to continue this. And after several years of a sustained campaign, Lufthansa announced that it would halt its participation in deportations. This actually didn't happen, and No One Is Illegal activists concede this, that they didn't actually do it. And partly because their ways of enacting deportation became less public, and because they started there was a shift to using charter airlines, which we see is ongoing now in the European Union, to carry out group deportations. But they still argued, when I interviewed these folks, I don't have this quote up, okay. They basically argued that they still felt it was a success because they got Lufthansa's CEO to say that we will stop participating in deportation. And in a way, they were getting Lufthansa to work for their content, to actually acknowledge that there was a problem with participating in deportations. And by making that kind of public statement and dissociating themselves, they felt that their message was successful, in a sense. So in terms of the ethical principles we can draw out from this particular campaign, it's really, again, questioning the ethics of what they call the deportation chain and the role of transportation companies in making money, that deportation becomes a kind of business of forced removals. Also highlighting the deaths that often happen when people are deported. And also ethically appealing to citizens and everyday people in their active capacity to accept or resist such actions, as well as to transportation employees and so on. So that was, in terms of ethics of borders, I think that's really something that this campaign was trying to highlight. I'm going to skip over, there's another campaign, if people are interested after. Some of the activists from No One Is Illegal continued another project called Schleussernet, where they actually posed as a company helping they were really trying to question this discourse of trafficking of migrants. And because they were German, there's a particular way in which, when East Germany was a communist country, what was now called trafficking used to be seen as a positive thing. There were actual businesses to help move people across the border illegally to help them escape communism. And so they did this whole project sort of trying to highlight the way that had shifted and question how trafficking campaigns today often hide what the actual problems are, which is first world nation states have very closed immigration policies that make it really difficult for people to get across, and that people are going to resort to these forms of businesses. So this was a different kind of corporate parody campaign where they sort of played the role of a trafficking business in a sense and did this whole campaign. And set up a sort of fake identity to do this. And I'll just close. I've skipped over the campaign a lot, but I thought this was an interesting, again, in terms of intervening in the image management of states. They say that for them as artists, they really felt that they had to, in a sense, adopt the strategies of the state, that the state was increasingly acting like an artist and creating these images of migration control, and creating this new image from what used to be called escape aids when you were helping people get out of East Germany, suddenly becoming trafficking. And so that they felt that they were just responding in the same way by trying to reverse that in a sense. So yeah, that's a little bit about Schleussernet. I'm going to move on. So there's two more campaigns I want to talk about. One is the occupation of the Bourse de Travail in Paris, France. And this is a long-standing form of mobilization in France. The sans-papier movements, as they're known, without papers, which basically means movements for undocumented peoples and undocumented workers, have a long history in France since the mid-90s. And it's actually interesting. I wrote and I researched this before Occupy. The Occupy movement started up in the United States. But you can really see how, in a sense, that movement was influenced by this form of occupation. It has actually a very long tradition in Europe, and in particular in France, where undocumented people would occupy churches, would occupy various places in terms of trying to demand status and to resolve their situations. And in this particular mobilization had its roots in a very particular government policy that the Sarkozy government brought in 2007. So they brought in a new law called the Loi Hortefeux that was introducing a new regulation that required employers to supply proof of residency permits for their employees. But, and again, this is where you see where the sometimes paradoxes, or one might say hypocrisy, of government policy towards undocumented workers is. On the one hand, they say they don't want them, that it's a problem, but on the other hand, whole countries, including, I think, both United States and Canada, we depend on that kind of labor a lot. They, on the one hand, they wanted to see residency permits, but once they started requesting them, they found that they were in a total bind because all these employers, suddenly said, we have lots of undocumented employees and we don't know what to do. So what they actually did, and this often is also something that periodically happens, is that states introduce regularization campaigns to regularize the status of a backlog of undocumented workers, which again is like this interesting loophole that happens where you say you don't want it, but then you'll acknowledge it in certain other moments. And so later that year, a new amendment was brought in to make allowances for employers to regularize the status of their employees if they were supposedly unaware that their employee was non-status. So this meant that the regularization of status of undocumented employees could be undertaken at the employer's initiative. Into this unequal dynamic stepped in one of the biggest unions in France, the CGT, sought to play an intermediary role in helping support the regularization of non-status employees. And they started several sans-papier strikes in businesses and restaurants along the Champs-Élysées and this kind of thing. But they also started facing criticism from some of the non-status workers in France because they didn't feel that there was sufficient consultation going on with them. And this is an important kind of principle of this kind of mobilization also, is that that non-status people themselves and migrants themselves need to play a very active role in controlling how these mobilizations happen. And what actually came out was that a federation of 4 sans-papier collectives in Paris started challenging the CGT, saying, you're only doing this for unionized workers, but most of us work in businesses of less than 10 people, and we're non-unionized, and we should be part of this regularization campaign as well. And in particular, this was true for a lot of women, undocumented women workers who work, tend to work in much smaller, non-unionized environments. So the culminating action was in May of 2008, when 1,300 sans-papiers occupied the Bourse de Travail, the head offices of the CGT near the Place de la République, and they renamed it the Ministry of Legalization of All Undocumented Workers. They're composed of predominantly Malian and Senegalese sans-papiers, and they occupied the Bourse de Travail for 13 months and built a strong community base in the process. A key aspect of their demands and what their analysis was also is understanding the colonial roots of immigration in France. And again, I think this has a lot of echoes in other contexts that we can apply this as well. That France colonized the countries that these workers are from and created a situation in which they were dispossessed and impoverished, and then it creates a migration chain that they then come, and a lot of the undocumented workers, it's a legacy of colonialism, in fact. So this is a quote from one of them: because France colonized Africa, we feel as though we are at home here. and talk about the days when immigration laws were different, and there was actually active recruitment of African workers, and there wasn't actually a different status. Another key principle was a clear articulation of self-organization and the affirmation of autonomy of undocumented workers as at the forefront of these movements. And this is something that they also put forward, that the sans-papiers wish to affect the decisions, that we need to be consulted and play a key role in this. What was also interesting in terms of the site of the occupation is also it was built as a space of openness to the surrounding community. So what they actually did is they built a broad base of neighborhood support. They had film screenings, music, community meals, regular public events in the occupation space, and really recruited community involvement in that way, and really articulated a strong politics of welcome, that we're a community together who needs to address this issue. Initially, they didn't have a lot of media coverage, partly because of tensions with the union and relations with the media, but eventually the occupation became a kind of event. And again, we see this with Occupy Wall Street, sort of taking up space, bodies taking up space together to kind of create an event. And again, this was very much developed by these movements. And the strategic visibility of the occupation also produced a protective function for otherwise isolated non-status workers who were vulnerable to deportation. So it was this kind of moment of also grabbing a kind of collective visibility and saying together, we're not as vulnerable to do this. So, as I say, initially, they didn't get much media coverage. They ended up getting a lot of international media coverage. They had their own press conferences, their own they started basically a newspaper, a website. And so what's also interesting is the way these kind of more do-it-yourself forms of media interventions became part of the occupation event itself. They held events and film screenings. They had a ball, like a dance of sans-papiers regularly. They had a regular radio show as well, which still goes on. I've actually been on it. And they had events like this where they invited hundreds of people. I don't know if we should, maybe you can just run it a little bit. This was a debate they called it the debate of the mattresses. So because there were 1,300 people occupying this space, sleeping on mattresses. Yeah, this is in French, so you won't understand it, but you get a little bit of sense of the atmosphere. It's like, several hundred people sitting on the mattresses in the occupation space having a debate. So, and then one of the most interesting ones that I just wanted to touch on a little bit was a set of sketches that was done by an artist named Laura Gens. And she was basically in solidarity. She wasn't a sans-papier herself, but she went to the occupation site every day, which lasted for a year and a half. And would do a different sketch of the people in the process of occupying the space. And these ended up, it's now published in a book as well, so each day what is going on in the occupation as a form of kind of interesting old school documentation. It has these kind of resonances of 19th century newspaper illustration as well. But it was also put online and diffused all over the place. So this is a press conference that they held on March 5th. And then these were also posted at the front of the occupation site. And also sold as postcards. So this was how a lot of fundraising for the occupation happened, was through selling these postcards and selling, by people doing the occupation on the street in France. And that's also interesting when you think about Paris as a site of French tourism and people buying these postcards, and kind of as an interesting form of image contamination in a sense as well. So yeah, that occupation lasted for about a year and a half. Eventually, it was expelled by force by the French police. And they did negotiate to get another occupation site where, on the Rue Baudalique, it was a warehouse where over 2,000 sans-papiers then occupied that space for about another year. And in the end, they were successful in pushing for the regularization of, several hundred of the people in the process. So, again, the kind of ethical claims and principles that came out of this particular mobilization was challenging the selectivity of regularization programs, and challenging the division of isolated, undocumented workers from workers who were, seen as deserving protection. And also highlighting the colonial legacies of migration from poor to rich countries and the responsibilities of rich nations to those dispossessed by the histories and policies that often dispossess these nations. How am I doing for time? Oh, 40 minutes, okay. I'll just touch on very quickly one last intervention then, because it's also in the US and I think of interest. And this is the Transborder Immigrant Tool, which is a project that was created by the Electronic Disturbance Theater that I mentioned in the first mobilization as well, and Bang Lab at the University of California at San Diego. And this includes artist, theorist Ricardo Dominguez, poet Amy Sarah Carroll, and others. And what they envisioned was a handheld GPS-enabled cell phone that could help migrants attempting to cross the US-Mexico border to locate water caches and also be able to navigate the dangerous parts of the border as they were crossing, while also sending them text messages with poetry to help rehumanize the border encounter. And this is just a prototype, it's a technological prototype, but the aim is to put technology into the hands of undocumented migrants trying to cross the border for life-saving purposes. And this is a quote from their website. You know, and so that what they're really highlighting is hundreds of people have died crossing the US-Mexico border due to not being able to tell where they are in relation to where they have been and which direction they need to go to reach their destination. So in a sense, they're trying to take these kind of mobile technologies and GPS technologies and turn them around, which are often used against these very same people, as we see with Project 28, and use them to actually help them navigate the system. And again, the ethical principles coming out of this is really trying to highlight, I think, the deadly nature of border crossings and policing for those with precarious means of movement who don't have access to the same kind of mobility that many northerners who go to Mexico, you know, for vacations do. So, and just as a little coda to that as well, given the politics of the virtual border technologies such as the SBI Net project, it's interesting to consider some of the recent political fallout that the Transborder Immigrant Tool generated. I don't know how many people have heard about this, but in January of 2010, the Electronic Disturbance Theater team was investigated by the University of California at San Diego and 3 Republican congressmen due to a media firestorm that was set off regarding the tool itself, which resulted in a deluge of hate mail and a public attack on the project by Fox News channel pundit Glenn Beck, who actually argued that the poetry in the project had the power to dissolve the nation. So this clearly set off some rather volatile sensitivities around the project. And the ED team then did a series of virtual sit-ins that were coordinated in response to this, and they were faced by further investigation by the FBI Office of Cybercrimes. And Dominguez faced the possibility of having his tenure revoked and the project canceled. So in the interim time, the investigations have been dropped, and the Transborder Immigrant Tool, which has only really functioned as a prototype to date, is now continuing development. But so it's interesting to kind of play this off of Project 28 in a sense and think about how such a small-scale transborder technological thing that was really merely a prototype could generate such a response and fury so close to the time that the billion-dollar prototyping fiasco of the SBI Net was quietly being shelved and retooled with very little media attention or political fanfare. And so I think that this says a lot about the sort of uneven politics of border technologies, and even as prototypes in this era of virtual borders. Yet, as the high-tech border becomes more mobile and technologically advanced, with initiatives such as the SBI Net, so too do the mobile practices and roots of migrant justice movements, no border activists, and media practitioners, as well as migrants who navigate the new mobilities of these borders on a very practical level. So I'm going to stop there and open it up to questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So, wow, okay, so we have quite a bit of time for any questions or if anyone wants to ask Dr. Vukov about her, what she's presented here or about her research more broadly.
Yes, I just have a question about some of the differences that exist.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting to talk about.
If it strikes me that one of the big ones is that the French intervention that you're discussing is really about undocumented immigrants sort of exercising their own political agency. You stress that in your aspect, that aspect of it in the talk. And I know that in the U.S., not so much in terms of what you've been describing with this Transborder Immigrant Tool project, but generally we've seen other examples of sort of immigrants attempting to exercise their own political agency, things like the Day Without an Immigrant and so on. I'm curious though about Germany, and because my understanding of the situation there is that there has been less sort of self-mobilization or self-organization of immigrants. And why do you think that is? I mean, in other words, why do you think in Germany you wind up getting a very sort of non-immigrant driven form of activism, so to speak, whereas you see immigrants more engaging in political agency in France and the US? Or perhaps you would dispute that distinction. I don't know, but I'd be curious to get your reaction on that.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting and a really good question. And I have some of what I presented here is going to be in a paper that's coming out later this year, and I do talk about that, not so much in terms of the US, but Germany and France. So I have to think a little bit more about the US context, but it's definitely come up a lot even among people in the movements in both Germany and France, and it's true that there is a lot more self-directed and active migrant justice organizing led by migrants and sans-papiers in France than Germany. And I asked, actually, the people I interviewed and the quotes I have, I asked them about this. And there's a couple of things. So one of them is perhaps the ironies of colonialism, that the sans-papiers in France tend to speak the same language as French activists, and so that there's a common language, and they don't necessarily, I mean, of course it's not true for everyone, but some of the most active movements, that's certainly the case. It's people from the Francophonie in Africa and, or the Middle East or elsewhere. So whereas in Germany, very often there's an additional language barrier among the migrants who are there, and that actually makes that kind of joint organizing trickier. So that's one of the things that they talked about. I know Farida Hook, who it was in Kein Mensch Ist Illegal and did a lot of the graphic designs, and then also Schleuserne, she talked about also the realities of German, particularly asylum laws, being so much more severe that they actually impede migrant and refugee organizing. Like very often, if you're housed in a particular center, in a particular neighborhood, you aren't allowed to go to the next neighborhood. So, they're at that extreme. That's the kind of the level of mobility control goes just beyond the border and is very managed. And so that makes it actually much more difficult for people to have the conditions to organize. So those were some of the reasons in terms of Germany. But I have to think a bit more. I mean, I have to say that some of the stuff I'm doing with the US is quite new for me. I'm based in Canada, and I've been doing a postdoc at Drexel, and so I've been thinking a lot more. And certainly, like I think it was the May 2006 mobilizations, were very exciting and interesting, and it's stuff that I'm still kind of looking at, so, yeah.
Did you also see differences in the different sites with violent versus peaceful protesting with the immigrants?
I guess it depends what you mean by that.
Like for example, in France, where the French were involved in maybe a negative way, there were any
Oh, you mean like in terms of the police response and things like that? Yeah. I mean, certainly, probably the fact that for some of the reasons that you just indicated in Germany. Although that would probably be different now, but because those campaigns were also led more by allies, or it was more of a mix, there's a certain kind of privilege, that comes with being a national of the right race and so on, that isn't going to meet the same kind of repression as undocumented, racialized people in France. So, that's probably a difference. Although what's interesting, and I didn't get a chance to talk about this, but certainly some of the kind of performances we saw in the airports that they were doing 10 years ago would be really difficult to do now. I mean, we've seen such a vast change in airport security policies. I mean, I even felt it today just flying from Philadelphia, which I wasn't crossing a border, but it's, the security procedures are so intense that it would be a lot harder to do that now. So I think that it wouldn't necessarily But there have been cases. About a year ago, some German activists who had been involved in Kein Mensch Ist Illegal were on a flight where a Malian man was being deported and actually got up, and a bunch of passengers actually joined them. And it turned into a big incident, and a bunch of them, like a father who was there with his 3 kids, got beaten by the police, and he was just a kind of everyday guy who saw what was going on and joined in on the action, But they actually did at least slow down the deportation of that individual. The deportation was canceled, the flight had to return, and so there's still these kinds of actions going on.
Thinking about kind of this Transborder Immigrant Tool project in America, I hadn't really heard of it. I'm just wondering if in Germany with the Luftwaffen, that deportationclass.com website, if that's something that the kind of everyday German knows about, or is something they have to search out and see, or how does the media kind of cover that topic or portray it?
Right. Well, with that particular campaign at that time, which was more like in the early 2000s, I think it actually succeeded in getting a lot of popular attention. And those movements were quite big. I mean, there were like hundreds of groups that came together, to kind of launch it. So they were actually quite successful at that time in getting quite a lot of popular consciousness and attention. And like I said, it's kind of interesting that the Electronic Disturbance Theater that did the they were involved in solidarity from the US in some of those actions as well. And so there was a dialogue going on even then. In terms of, have people heard about the Transborder Immigrant Tool controversy that happened last year and so on? Because maybe it's more in California and stuff, but it did get a certain amount of media attention. And as I say, for something that doesn't even really exist, it's more an idea. And I think that was part of the idea of the intervention and intervening on a kind of image level. But yeah, maybe it's different scales of movements and different locations as well. So, yeah.
Kind of following on from some of the questions we've already had here. So, like Jennifer pointed out, you were really emphasizing the fact that the migrants, the undocumented migrants themselves, kind of needed to be the agents of a lot of these mobilizations. But what kind of participation can other people do, right? And whether you witnessed in your research kind of effective forms of solidarity. I think the artist who did the sketches seems like a nice example of that. But for example, like us here at Holy Cross, for example, what beyond maybe participating in an anti-deportation protest on an airplane, what are some effective ways of being in solidarity with these?
Yeah, I would say that even like in the case of the sans-papier movements in France, which, again, there's a very strong ethic of being migrant-led, but there's still a lot of cross-fertilization and participation of allies. Like in that occupation, I went there fairly regularly, and there were lots of people doing various kinds of support, from like bringing food, stopping by, hanging out, talking to people, to I remember it was an Italian guy who was helping run the newspaper. There's a lot of labor involved in that kind of stuff, so that was a lot of ways that I think allies or non-migrant peoples were involved even in those. But I think it was a principle about like, you need to consult with us, we need to have an active role in setting. Because, of course, I think in most places there's a little bit of a history of a certain kind of paternalism when people sort of want to help, but without really creating a dialogue or really learning what those people's issues are or what their priorities are. And that's what's, I think, interesting with the French movements, is, that, and as you say, in, the US with the May Day kind of mobilizations and so on. Certainly in my experience, I've been more involved in these movements in the context of Montreal and Quebec, and there's very much a kind of coalition of, the term is directly affected, versus people who are more in solidarity. So I think there's many different ways, to do that. But, part of it is also trying to create a context where people can take leadership and have the kind of community support to be able to do that. So, yeah.
Another question. I'm just curious how Canadians, if you're comfortable sharing kind of feel about immigrants, or where are most immigrants coming from that are in Canada? Is it mostly from Mexico up through, or I'm just ignorant on that subject, I apologize.
Right. Well, it depends where in Canada. It's also, I'm based in Quebec, and it tends to have a pretty different, because it's more francophone. So there's a lot more immigrants from, again, this francophonie, Francophone Africa, the Middle East. But I mean, overall, I think in English Canada, it tends to be more China, South Asia, that. But I mean, you see that in Quebec as well. And I mean, interestingly, the Canadian government, currently the government that's in place is putting in, really trying to close down and putting in policies right now around refugees, and requesting visas, demanding visas. So they just basically put, I think a year and a half ago, visas for Mexicans who could travel visa free before, and ostensibly because they've sort of responded to this image of like false refugee claims, but there's a lot of Mexicans who are living in areas where there's kind of, not so low intensity civil conflicts and making refugee claims, and based on that, they've suddenly requested slapped visas on them, as well as I think again to try and close down the refugee process for Roma, Gypsy people from Eastern Europe, like the Czech Republic and Hungary and so on. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on right now that's not something to be particularly proud of. Thank you.